Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Brian Berletic, a former U.S. Marine, a journalist, and also the host of the new Atlas. And I will leave a link to it in the description. So thank you for coming back on the program.
Thank you so much for having me back.
So we see that Russia, well, recently now just launched its largest drone strikes on Ukraine with over 800 drones, also complemented with missiles, and the pressure is now intensifying across the entire front line. Now, given that the Trump is having this diplomatic efforts to end the war, he's saying again that he's disappointed and he will therefore support new sanctions. We also see rhetoric from the political media establishment across NATO that this is evidence that Russia does not want peace. What do you make of this development?
Well, again, it's very important for people to understand what exactly this conflict is in the first place. The Trump administration itself has admitted and has blamed the previous Biden administration for starting the war, and they've characterized it as a U.S. proxy war against Russia. So it really is not up to Russia to end a war that is being waged against them by the United States, according to the Trump administration itself. It is up to the Trump administration to look at how this proxy war began, how it is being fought, and what measures need to be taken to stop it. For example, there is a U.S. military command in Germany right now overseeing the entire conflict in Ukraine. They are at the very top of the chain of command of Ukraine's armed forces, not Ukrainian generals, American generals. If President Trump put an end to that, brought these generals back home, or put them in charge of something that actually had to do with American national security, the war would end. It would end very quickly. Another factor fueling this war is the United States and its directive to the Europeans to continue funding and arming and training the Ukrainians. And also, and again, as the Western media itself has admitted, the United States Central Intelligence Agency is running Ukraine's intelligence networks inside Ukraine right now. That is another aspect of this war that if President Trump decided, he could end overnight and the conflict would end. So he's not serious about ending this conflict. And if people look back at his rhetoric, even before the elections, he was more or less telling people that he had no intention of ending it. He told people what they wanted to hear. But if you looked at the so-called peace plans that were being proposed, he was talking about freezing the conflict, which is the overarching agenda of the United States. If you want to call it a deep state, this is what was already underway during the Biden administration. They were losing the proxy war. The prospect of Ukrainian lines collapsing were increasing. And so they wanted to freeze it. They do not want to end it. This is about pulling Russia in, tying them down, while the United States pivots to China, Iran, and elsewhere, and then circle back around to Russia later. This is referred to as strategic sequencing, and this is what policymakers involved in the current Trump administration have laid out extensively in policy papers spanning many years.
I was wondering, can you explain this concept of strategic sequencing in terms of the U.S. Well, in this case, study the U.S. Proxy war against Russia?
Yeah, so the U.S. establishment, whether it's headed nominally by Democrats or Republicans, seeks primacy over the entire globe. All of these policy papers connected to either administration, all they talk about is maintaining America's dominance over the entire planet. It is to remain the largest sole superpower of the globe. And in order to do this, the United States needs to prevent all peer and near peer competitors from rising up and challenging its position globally. This is not about American national security. This is about America being able to do as it pleases worldwide, as it has for nearly a century now. And so strategic sequencing is a realization that the United States is incapable, does not have the resources to fight nations like Russia, China, Iran, and all of their allies around the globe all at the same time. They need to tie one down and then focus its resources on another. There's also this concept of division of labor, which was publicly stated by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth back in February. The need for nations the U.S. essentially influences and for all intents and purposes controls have them direct public resources to American foreign policy objectives. For Europe, for example, that would be taking public resources and channeling it into this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. For Japan or South Korea, or now the Philippines, completely politically captured by the US, that is directing public resources that would be used for the people in these countries to building up their military and encroaching upon and encircling and containing China in the Asia-Pacific region. And so strategic sequencing, right now, as it stands, the U.S. is prioritizing China as the greatest threat to its hegemony, not to America where it exists on a map, but to its hegemony over the planet. And so they need to pause the conflict in Ukraine against Russia and pivot towards China. So this is strategic sequencing. Deal with China first, and then circle back around to Russia later. But they cannot allow Russia the freedom to rebuild its military, to redirect its resources in support of its allies, which includes China. That's why they need to freeze the conflict in Ukraine, not end it.
Yeah, people I just have a hard time imagining that yeah, the United States, I assume that they want the war to come at least to a temporary halt, given that they have other priorities. But this control that not just the United States, but the political West has established over Ukrainian intelligence services, and also having now large control over hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, which they can use to fight a strategic rival. I mean, it's hard to imagine that they simply want to give this all up because humanitarian concerns or yeah, just a desire to get along better with Russia. So it does look like the main well, the best possible outcome for them would be to dial down the war a bit as to prevent Ukraine from collapsing, but also giving the United States some time to address its other priorities around the world. I think around the whole rhetoric of helping Ukraine, one forgets that this covers up the massive investments that have been done in building this. I mean, as you remember as well, back in 2014, on the first day after the coup, the United States already began to set up this partnership with Ukraine. From 2015 and all, you had the Washington Post reporting that the U.S. was rebuilding Ukraine's intelligence services from scratch because, the former ones was partnered with, well, they were partnered with Russia, so they weren't reliable. And again, the attraction of controlling these intelligence services was to use them as an instrument against the Russians. So they've been doing this for over a decade, and it's just, I can't imagine them wanting to give up this massive control. I mean, they control much of the government, the military, the intelligence services, the media, the civil society through all these NGOs. I mean, what Russia demands, a decoupling away from Ukraine. This would be, I guess, a repeat of what happened in 2010, because in 2004 we had the Orange Revolution. We had the Yushchenko in instead. He was going to pull all Ukraine into the NATO orbit, decouple from Russia. But then democracy happened. This was not popular among the Ukrainians. He ended up with like 2 or 3% approval rating, and they voted in Yanukovych in 2010. And that whole long process, that huge investment, was essentially lost as Ukraine began to make itself more neutral again, or non-aligned. And now, I guess, NATO risks the same thing, that Ukraine will fall out of its orbit and return to some kind of neutral status. It's hard to imagine this happening, but towards that end, though, how extensive is the U.S. still involved in the war?
Tremendously, and at every single level. And what they're realizing is that as things are going right now, if this continues, eventually Ukraine's military is going to collapse. And so they're preparing for that. Ideally, they would like to freeze it like they did when this all first began in 2014, and the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. That was a means of saving the Ukrainian military, which was on the verge of collapsing then, freezing it, and then allowing the U.S. and its client states across Europe to rebuild, reorganize, rearm Ukraine's forces for the next round of violence. So they're just seeking to do this all over again. Freeze it before they collapse, begin rearming them. And this is what the US has tasked Europe with doing, because the US needs to save its own resources for focusing on China, Iran, and elsewhere, as part of this strategic sequencing. The division of labor absolved the US from primarily investing in Ukraine, free up resources for elsewhere. So that is exactly what they're doing. They have no intention at all whatsoever of making any sort of peace with Russia. And as you point out, this goes all the way back to the beginning of the 21st century, and obviously well before it. And this demonstrates continuity of agenda. It does not matter who Americans vote for, who is in the White House, who controls Congress. This is a singular agenda that continues no matter what. And despite the very vocal opposition President Trump during the campaign season had against all, the so-called deep state and the forever wars abroad, he has continued absolutely every single war that he inherited from the Biden administration, just as Biden did from the Trump administration and Trump did from the Obama administration. And he has started new wars against Yemen and Iran. He is building up for war against Venezuela very openly and obviously. And they are still planning to pivot toward Asia. And so this all continues uninterrupted, and it will continue. It will not be America that restrains itself. There is no prospect of change in America politically. The special interests driving this are unelected. They are monolithic. There really is no one else in the U.S. capable of challenging or displacing them. It will be up to the multipolar world to stop and then eventually reverse this.
One of the things I do like about Trump, though, is the fact that he's not captive to the whole weird notion that you can't talk to the opponent because they are bad guys. So, for example, he met with, in his first administration, a North Korean leader. Now he's meeting with Putin. And I think this for me, this is a thing which we have, one of those things we refer to as a moral virtue, that we don't talk to bad people, and so, but that also means we don't do diplomacy. I like this aspect, but on the other hand, it also appeared in the media recently that while he was in North Korea to meet Kim Jong-un, he also had his Navy SEALs do an operation against North Korea in which they killed a lot of civilians, fishermen, and then pulled away. But it's a little bit like the deception of Iran. I'm happy they want to talk and find a peace agreement, but when you're planning a strike in the middle of this, it is a bit deceptive. But on the topic, though, of peace efforts, the main, I guess, next step in this narrative of, first he met with Zelensky and Putin in Alaska, then he met with Zelensky and the Europeans at the White House. Now this big new step is to have Zelensky and Putin meet. I guess, what is the purpose of this meeting? Because usually you would have the state leaders would come and meet each other once all the main issues have been resolved, and they come for the grand finale to shake hands and put their signature down. The optics of it. But when neither side is prepared to make any real concessions, including the United States, what are they actually meeting for? What's the purpose of this peace initiative, if you will call it?
Well, first, addressing President Trump's willingness to speak with supposed American adversaries or declared American adversaries, we have to think back to the time when then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton met with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and they reset U.S.-Russian relations. And this was following another U.S. proxy war against Russia, this time using Georgia as a battering ram in 2008 against Russian forces along their southern border in the Caucasus region. And that was a failure. And the U.S. hit a brick wall, and they needed to reset their relations. So someone like U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who we know isn't interested in diplomacy at all, met with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. What was the purpose of this? It was to draw in the Russians and trick them. And that is exactly why President Trump is now meeting with people. And as you point out, even as he was meeting with North Korea's leadership, he had people inside North Korea murdering North Koreans. And then as he was talking with the Iranians, all along preparing to strike at and kill Iranians and wage war against Iran. So there is no actual interest in diplomacy. It is all a trick. It is to draw in other nations. It is to make the United States look like it is the reasonable one, and it is these nations that are intent on continuing the war. And I have a funny feeling that that is why President Trump wants President Putin to meet with President Zelensky. And I forget who says it. I don't think that President Putin would have said something like this, because he's usually very polite no matter how upset he is. But someone somewhere said that this would be like a dog is barking at you and you get on your knees, your hands on your knees, and you bark back at the dog instead of talking to the person holding the leash. This is the equivalent of the Russians meeting with Ukraine's leadership when they're not actually in charge of anything. The people holding the leash is the United States. This is a U.S. war fought against Russia through Ukraine. And no amount of talking to Ukraine is going to change that. This needs to be resolved with the United States. And what we have seen is, despite Russia coming to these meetings and going through the motions, it is determined to solve this conflict on the battlefield. And that is what we are watching right now. They are remaining open to diplomacy. They know it will go nowhere, and they will settle this on the battlefield. And that, I think, that is ultimately where this conflict will be settled.
Yeah, I haven't read that quote yet, but it sounds like something that Lavrov or Peskov would say, I guess.
Yes.
But I guess what I've been looking for, though, from the United States is a good indication of the genuinely wanting to reset proper relations with Russia, would be to have them articulate some kind of a concept of what they believe peace is, because traditionally, if you have as many centers of power, peace, as all people would have recognized, is dependent on pursuing some path of indivisible security, somewhere you make sure that one side doesn't enhance its security at the expense of the other. So, for example, arms control, you would do, both sides would reduce, and thus they would maintain the same amount of security, but reducing the weapons. So overall, one side wouldn't get advantage over the other. I mean, this is why you have common security architectures and all. But we would look for arguments that they should harmonize interest. Where can we mitigate competition? Where can we end it? But instead, over the past 30 years, we had the opposite, which is the hegemonic peace. And in the hegemonic peace, you don't need to take into account the security concerns of the other guy. You just make sure you're so dominant, it doesn't really matter what the other weaker counterpart thinks. So I haven't really seen any concept of security come out which kind of repudiates this the past 30 years. And I heard Marco Rubio refer to saying that we're in a multipolar world, but thereafter one almost get the idea that the strategy is, well, how can we restore the unipolarity then, as opposed to how do we learn to live with the other. So this is, I guess, one of my great disappointments, because if you don't learn to adjust to the multipolar realities, I think the United States will also get crushed at the end by getting too many enemies, and also incentivizing these enemies to align themselves against America. But I heard the media now criticize or ask different leaders such as J.D. Vance whether or not the United States, Putin is stringing along Trump in these talks. Again, it does appear that the Russians have been fairly consistent all along, but what are you reading into these comments that the Russians are stringing along? Is this now the Russians not wanting peace and buying time, or have they changed their demands? So this seems to become a new talking point. Whenever the media begin to coalesce around one talking point, it's worth, I guess, exploring what it actually means.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. If the U.S. was actually interested in peace, it would be pursuing entirely different policies, and it isn't. So it's obvious that they have no interest in peace at all. And yes, Secretary of State Marco Rubio acknowledged the existence of the multipolar world, but only as an obstacle to climb over to reestablish American dominance over the planet. And they are obviously openly pursuing that across the four corners of the globe. Now, as far as Russia stringing the Americans along, as you said, Russia has been consistent all along. They have never changed their original demands. Everything that they had said in the very beginning remains in place, unchanged. And all they want is this proxy war being waged against them by the United States to end, and the very source driving this proxy war to be ended. And that is America's insistence on dominating the planet, dominating Europe, pushing its influence up to and all along Russia's borders, and even inside Russian borders. They demand that this stops. This is existential for them. This is not something that they're imagining. As we watch Syria disappear off the map, Libya already gone, U.S. forces still in Iraq, Iran being attacked out of the blue during negotiations. Russia isn't imagining this. And this is what they have demanded from day one. And the Americans refuse to acknowledge or accept this, and they will continue pushing. So they want the illusion of peace with Russia so they can freeze the conflict, so they can circle back around and finish it later. This is their intent. And at this point, it should be obvious to everybody, because like you said, if they were actually interested in working together with the rest of the world rather than imposing itself upon it, there would be definite policies at least being talked about. They're not even talking about policies like this. They're openly pursuing policies that feed into continued American primacy. Absolutely everything that they're doing. They're rebuilding their whole military to wage large-scale war against peer adversaries like Russia and China. The ERAM missile that they're talking about sending to Ukraine, so somewhere around 3,000 of them eventually, obviously not in the beginning. This is a munition that has been developed specifically for the type of warfare the U.S. envisions it itself will be fighting against nations like Russia and China in the near future. So they are fully preparing to continue this, continuing it more forcefully if necessary. And if they can buy time and perform strategic sequencing, that would be ideal. And that is where we are right now.
On this idea that the United States is not actually pursuing a peace, it is interesting that the format they have for finding this peace. I mean, part of the reason why they're saying they're putting pressure on the European Zelensky and now threatening to destroy the Russian economy, sending all these new missiles. This kind of seems to coincide with the peace initiative, given that you have to pressure all sides to get closer together. But again, as you mentioned before, given that Trump has previously recognized that this is a proxy war, why is the U.S. not having any role in actually making any concessions? Because it looks as if it has solely taken on the role as a mediator. But the whole idea of bringing Ukraine and the Russian position closer, again, my question is always why is not bringing Ukraine into NATO the responsibility of NATO? Why does Ukraine have to renounce the path to join NATO? Why isn't it upon the United States and NATO to say, well, actually, we can't, we're going to have a proper pan-European security architecture where we don't push the military blocks on the Russian borders, again, indivisible security. But why is this Ukraine's responsibility? What if the United States actually wanted to bring this war to an end? What could it do besides playing the mediator?
Well, I mean, that's it exactly, isn't it? The U.S. is pursuing this war against Russia while also posing as mediator. That right there is a fundamental obstacle to achieving anything, because if you're not even being honest about what the conflict is, you're admitting that it's a proxy war, that it's your proxy war against Russia. You're blaming the Biden administration for starting it, which gives you an easy exit out of it. You could just say this was Biden's policy and we reject it. It was terrible. Look at what it has caused, and we are exiting from it. But the reality is the same special interests that compelled the Biden administration to launch this proxy war, compelling the Trump administration to continue it. And again, just as we've already seen in this specific conflict, not even talking about elsewhere, the US has used this cycle of propaganda, feigned desire for peace, and then continued war. They've already done this in regards to Ukraine, the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. They're recreating this. And just because Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth back in February said this must not be Minsk 3.0 doesn't mean that it isn't exactly Minsk 3.0, because then he explains what it is. It is freezing the conflict along the line of contact. It is moving European troops into Ukraine to basically create a bluff against Russia. If you try to restart this, you're going to have to fight through European, essentially NATO troops. And Europe is going to continue arming and backing the Ukrainians, and they're going to rebuild and reorganize their military during this pause. So all that is Minsk 3.0. And so what the Trump administration is doing is trying to have it both ways, trying to absolve itself from responsibility for causing this or continuing this conflict, blame it on Russia for this conflict continuing, posing as some sort of mediator that is, we're just so frustrated that the Europeans and Ukrainians, who we completely control, won't make peace with Russia because we told them not to. I mean, this is exactly what's playing out. And the short and simplest answer is the US, this current administration and all administrations before it, they're just simply lying. They're lying about their intentions. And through their actions, we can see what their true intentions actually are. And that is to freeze this war, to wage much more dangerous wars elsewhere, and then circle back around to Ukraine and Russia again, because they've already done this cycle once already with the Minsk agreements.
Yeah, Trump seems always to pride himself of this strategic ambiguity and being powerful yet peaceful. So he wants to balance too much, which is why, he makes always the argument the war would never have happened if I was president. This was foolish by Biden. And then in the same breath, he will then take credit for no one sent more weapons. Obama didn't send anything. I sent the javelins in my first administration. So he's the one who even Obama, who backed the coup in Ukraine, recognized that this would be foolish, because he would, if he escalate it towards a direct confrontation or go up the escalation ladder, it would be foolish in Obama's mind, because the Russians would have the benefit of proximity, which is important for logistics. And also, at the end of the day, it would be more important for the Russians than the United States, because it's on the other side of the planet for America, while for Russia, it's an existential threat. So they would be willing to go all the way, and they would have the benefit of not just industrial production, but also logistics. But again, Trump seems to want it both ways. He's a brilliant, brutal, and tough. At the same time, he wants to be the man of peace. So it does appear, though, based on, I think we agree that the diplomatic efforts aren't really going anywhere. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but if this is the case, the war will then be decided on the battlefield. But how far are we away from something like this? What do you see at the moment on the front lines?
Well, as you noted earlier, Russia carried out one of, or if not the largest drone and missile strike so far. But isn't that something we find ourselves saying almost every single month now? And this is because of Russia's military industrial capacity. It is not just enormous, but it continues to expand. And this is what myself and others, yourself, Alex and Alexander of the Duran, they have been following this for 3+ years now. Alexander Micuras called it aggressive attrition. That is exactly what the Russians are doing. I still see Western analysts claiming, well, Russia is failing because they cannot break through. They're not breaking through here. Look at how little territory they've taken this month. It isn't about territory. It isn't about breaking through. It is about grinding Ukraine's fighting capacity down to where it eventually collapsed. This is what we actually saw in Syria. And in this case, it worked in favor of U.S. foreign policy objectives. That conflict was frozen for years. The front line didn't move anywhere. And then suddenly, because the Syrian Arab army was hollowed out over years and years, and because Russia and Iran were distracted elsewhere, eventually a hard push came and everything just collapsed. And that is possible in Ukraine. That is possible. And that is why the United States is telling Europe, you need to create a coalition of the willing. A lot of people imagine that Europe came up with this on their own. This was in the public directive Secretary Hegseth gave in February. He told the Europeans, you're going to send troops into Ukraine. And the reason they're sending troops into Ukraine is because they know that eventually Ukrainian lines are going to collapse. The military will collapse. We're already hearing admissions from Ukraine itself. They have so little manpower along the line of contact. There are entire sections of the front that just aren't even manned. There are defenses in place, but there are no people in those defenses. And that's why when you look at the map, you will see Russia break through, and then it'll start to expand. And then the Ukrainians, like a fire brigade, they have to send their reserves to that area, and then Russia will withdraw. They're not trying to break through and take that territory. They're trying to overstretch Ukrainian lines, and it's working. And we can see demonstratably so that the metrics of Ukraine's military power waning day by day. And there's nothing that the West can do about it except intervene directly and hope that the Russians pause for thought and stop instead of fighting through European troops at that point. That's where it is right now.
There is it is interesting when the parties are that far apart. You would want to weaken the adversary to get concessions, but it's very strange that when Ukraine and NATO strike deep inside Russia to hit its energy infrastructure, the media goes into celebration. Yay! Now we're putting pressure on Russia. Now they will be forced to accept to discuss peace seriously. And when Russia does exactly the same thing, that is, strike energy infrastructure deep inside Ukraine, we get the message that, well, this is evidence that they do not want peace, because if they would want peace, they wouldn't do exactly what we're doing to Russia. They would do the opposite. They wouldn't strike at all. So it's an interesting way of looking at it. But you mentioned that the next step, as the front lines, I guess anyone paying close attention see that this is falling apart. Well, what's possible now for the West to do? You mentioned the possibility of direct intervention. Do you see NATO countries beginning to send their troops directly in? Because I think, as you mentioned before, the United States would prefer if the Europeans join in on fighting to the last man. But how capable are the Europeans? Besides from weak armies, we just had a collapse in the French government. The French, Germans, British government, they all seem to be competing for who can be the most unpopular and economically weak now, it seems. So how credible is it that the Europeans can actually send troops in?
Well, I don't think that's any more credible than the idea of Ukraine stopping the Russians. I think the United States just sees Europe as an extension of this proxy war, expendable proxies that they can send in to extend the duration of this conflict and raise the cost for Russia. The entirety of this conflict, going all the way back to 2014, Europe was clearly expendable in every sense, not just in the sense of we're forcing them to invest heavily in Ukraine, but the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, cutting all of Europe off from cheap, affordable Russian energy. And then when you really think about it, before 2014, Russia was no threat to Europe in any shape, form, or way. They were cooperating closely together. They depended on each other. As you say, that you have to align interests, and this is how you achieve peace. And that was already achieved between Europe and Russia. And it was the United States who forced this issue, who forced Europe and Russia apart. And they didn't do this. They didn't do this by forcing the governments in Europe to go along. In a sense, they did. But the very creation of the European Union as a layer bureaucracy thrown over the individual European states themselves smothers their sovereignty. This is a bureaucracy that answers to the same special interests driving U.S. foreign policy. And because of that, these governments in power and interlocking with the European Union were making decisions that were demonstrably opposed to the best interests of these European states. and all of the people living within their borders. So you look at Germany right now, the state that they are in economically and politically. You just mentioned the political instability in France, which I think ultimately doesn't matter, because if you look at the leading parties in all of these countries, it's exactly like in the United States. They pose as having differing ideologies and agendas, but at the end of the day, once they worm their way into power, they go along with the program. I remember a lot of people invested hope in the Italian Maloney, and thinking that she would, and she had said things before she got into office that she was going to put her foot down and stop all of this. Except as soon as she got into office, she continued all of it. This is how the West deals with the public. They create a strategy of tension, a socio-political, ideological strategy of tension. They control all of the major players, and they can direct where it goes, and they can ensure continuity of agenda no matter which ideology is prevailing at any given time. And I'm afraid that this is going to work in Germany, no matter who gets into office. And again, I was listening to the Duran, and they were talking about the Power Siberia 2 pipeline and how this cements the flow of Russian energy eastward instead of westward. So Europe, even if they do somehow have a revolution and break free of American hegemony, that energy is gone and it's not coming back. And so the possibility of repairing the damage that's been done because of this, that prospect is so minuscule. And I'm afraid that the U.S. sees this. They see Europe as in a declining state, and they just see, well, if we use them as proxies now, they'll be more powerful this year than they will next year. Next year, they'll be even weaker. Let's use them while we still can. Let's use them while they still have some strength. And it's not about whether European troops can go into Ukraine and defeat the Russians. It's about doing the exact same thing the Ukrainian military itself has done. Just draw it out, raise the cost, tie Russia down, while the United States addresses China, Iran. Now we have Venezuela and all the other places the U.S. seeks to reassert hegemony. Hold them for at least that long, and then we can circle back around and get Russia later. So that's what Europe represents to the United States: additional time to perform strategic sequencing.
Yeah, once when he was NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, he went to the United States and he was trying to sell the war because people were losing some interest, the public, and he was trying to sell the war as a great advantage because the U.S. would have all this, hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened Ukrainian soldiers being able to contain Russia, so the U.S. could focus on China. So more or less what you're saying. But now, of course, it's strange to me that the Europeans do not see that they may take over that role of the Ukrainians, someone to be used as a proxy to throw at Russia. That is, they're already fighting this war to the last euro. If they would start to enter some military forces, well, then of course it would get much worse. Just on the economic part of this, for me, this is very strange because you mentioned that there's economic interdependence between the Europeans and Russians, but often what countries seek to do is have asymmetrical interdependence to make sure that they depend on you, you don't depend on them. And in 2014, the Europeans were in a good position. There was mutual dependence. However, the Russians were using our technologies, our industries, our transportation corridors, our ports and all, our banks, the SWIFT payment system, our currencies in international trade. So they were very dependent on us. What we were dependent on them was energy security, to have energy supplies. But even on this, the Russians were dependent on Europe as an energy consumer. So we had the balance was very much in our favor. But as you said, now the Russians have decoupled completely due to weaponization. So all the influence we had in the past, I think, is long gone. Just a last question. In terms of, you mentioned the Frontlines collapsing. What do you make of the desertion ratio? Because when a war comes to an end, you would expect to see communication lines decline and more casualties spike, but also desertions. How are you reading the different numbers? Is it exaggerated, or do you see this intensifying? Because I have a bit trouble to find reliable numbers. Again, we are in information war, so it's difficult to get the right numbers.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's very hard to find reliable numbers if they're even out there. So what you have to do instead is just look at how the battlefield is shaping up, and you can tell a lot by that. You're not going to get a definite number, but you can obviously see something is happening to Ukraine's manpower. Something is happening to it because now there are entire sections of defenses that are unmanned. So where did all those people go? They either died, they were injured, or they deserted. So it's got to be one of these three issues. And then reconstituting Ukrainian manpower. This has always been a problem. I've been talking about this for years, and I've explained how they're talking about rebuilding a brigade, building a whole new brigade. We're talking about 4,000 men. Is not about just taking 4,000 men, putting them through basic training, and then putting them in the field as a brigade and its subunits. It's not about that. Every level of the brigade requires leadership. They require non-commissioned officers and actual officers, including some senior officers at the very top of the brigade. That type of training and experience takes years to acquire. And if you're suffering high attrition rates like Ukraine, as we suspect Ukraine is, you simply cannot rebuild these brigades. And that is what we're seeing on the battlefield. We're seeing people with basic training and scattered leadership, and these units are inadequate, and this is why everything continues to crumble. This is why there are sections of the defenses unmanned, and this is why they're losing territory. This is why this is going to continue to accelerate. And I actually did just see a Western analyst admit that casualties, territorial gains by Russia, casualties on the Ukrainian side, desertion rates, this is not linear where it just goes up or down in a straight line. It is exponential. So as all of this continues, everything continues to build up and it accelerates the rate everything begins to collapse. So we're watching that already happen very obviously. If you look at the front lines last year compared to this year, how quickly everything is going now versus last year. That's obviously happening. And then there will be a point where it just starts going so quickly, absolutely nothing can be done to stop it, which is what happened in Syria, as a matter of fact. That will eventually happen. It's impossible to predict when. You or I, we only have access to what is publicly available. I'm sure there are intelligence networks on both sides that are aware of when this is going to happen and that might be why we see such urgency by the United States and the Europeans and the willingness to do increasingly drastic things to try to force the Russians into freezing this conflict, because they know if that collapse happens, it's not going to be about whether the Russians take all of the Donbas region. It'll be how much do they just decide to take, because there won't be anything to stop them. This is why they're talking about sending European troops into Ukraine. This was always a prospect since the beginning of the conflict. This is something many analysts were warning about from the very beginning. If that collapse takes place, the West will have to intervene because there will be no other way to stop the Russians. So this is why we see the U.S. Pretty much trying anything. We'll meet with you. You should meet with Zelensky. Do this, do that. We'll do this. But the one thing they're not willing to do is genuinely end the proxy war they're waging against Russia. That's the one thing they won't do, and Russia knows it. So they're going to continue on the battlefield. And we're in uncharted territory. We don't exactly know what is going to happen when it is Russian forces facing off against essentially NATO forces in Ukraine, if Europe and the United States, and essentially the United States decides to do that.
Yeah, there's some unverified reports that the British are, as well as French, are strengthening their position, not just in Kiev, but also in Odessa, given that one of the benefits of keeping Ukraine in the NATO orbit is Odessa, because this would be quite important to strengthen NATO's role in the Black Sea vis-a-vis the Russians. It's as you said before, the whole point of a war of attrition is once the adversary has been bled, then all the territorial issues, all of this will then just fall in line, which is why I'm for 3.5 years been so frustrated when all the media does is measure progress in terms of territorial conquest, when it doesn't really make sense. This is more of a symptom of where the real indicators are. That is the attrition rates and the ability to regenerate the army. But anyways, thank you so much for taking the time. It's one does get the impression now that something big is about to happen. As all of these things, the front lines are cracking, the Russians are now going after bridges and targets in the deep rear, and they appear to be preparing for a massive offensive, one which already might have started, by the way. So thank you again.
Thank you.